Good afternoon. Welcome to Professor Speaks. My name is Alex Hernandez. This is Dr. Craig Stern, President of Pro Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and Pro Data Analytics. Today we're going to be talking about the medical use of marijuana, not the recreational. Sorry. Anyways, the medical use of marijuana is very controversial still, even though it's being legalized across the U.S. actually, and there seems to be very little evidence to support the use of medical marijuana. Most of that is partly due to the federal regulations on medical marijuana. It's still a Schedule One drug, which is in the same category as heroin, and just above Schedule Two category drugs like cocaine and methamphetamines. Um, Dr. Craig Stern, with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, marijuana was placed in the Schedule One category. But tell us how this makes it difficult for marijuana to be studied.
Yeah, that's a good question. Clearly, we're dealing with an area where we have recreational use and we have medical use, and the medical use and the rationale for medical use is relatively new with regard to the history of what's going on. In the United States, with the Controlled Substances Act, which deals with drugs that are addictive, abusive, etc., there are 5 schedules. Schedule 1 cannot be prescribed by a doctor in the United States. And then Schedules 2 through 5 can be. In some states, Schedule 5 are even sold over the counter in cough and cold type medications. But in Schedule 2, there are limits in the kind of prescription that can be written and the quantities that can be written, the number of refills, etc., and others. In Schedule 1 was established for drugs that either had no medical use at all, were addictive, or that had problems with lack of knowledge of what the safety of the medication is. And as Alex has talked about, we're dealing with drugs like heroin and things like that. So there's always been a stigma attached to Schedule 1 because these are drugs that have no particular medical use other than potentially for recreational use. The difficulty is that about 28 states, including the District of Columbia, have approved the use of medical marijuana. Now, that didn't change what the federal law said. It only identified what you could do in those given states as long as it was done within the state. So it was prescribed for a patient that was domiciled in the state. It was a physician who was licensed in the state, and the use would be in the state. Well, in the case of Title I prohibits any kind of research to go on in humans or in animals.
Right.
So that there can be no studies that either deal with safety, effectiveness, they can't even deal with contaminants in the product in that regard. So all of the states, including California, which was the first in legalizing medical marijuana, have the problem that their physicians can prescribe, but if they move outside the scope of the law in what it says and what can be done is, namely, they can recommend, they can discuss the use of medical marijuana, they may even prescribe, but they're outside the scope of it as soon as they begin to help the patient to get marijuana, to use it for a need other than for the medical marijuana prescription that is documented in the chart. So there's the rub. The rub is that you may be able to do it in the state, but federal law says no, and federal law prohibits any kind of research to go on with regard to the product.
That would certainly make it tough. And what we did mention that it's very difficult to study medical marijuana, but there has been few studies, and of the few studies, generally, what are the findings from those studies?
Yeah, interestingly, because there's been so many states that have approved it, there has been some recent studies. A study from the federal government in 2017 identified about 10,000 studies that have been done. What they identified is that the studies were poorly done There were poor placebo controls. There were poor controls about it to identify effectiveness or to deal with the safety of the med. But what they did find is that the marijuana, medical marijuana, has been used clearly for nausea and vomiting secondary to cancer chemotherapy. It has been used in some degree with regard to multiple sclerosis and in migraine therapy. But what they did find is that use in epilepsy, there was no evidence in any of those 10,000 studies that could confirm its use. They also identified there was no evidence that could confirm its use in Parkinson's disease. And because there has been a side effect or the effect of the drug as being a impact on muscle spasticity, so it took away some of the stiffness in the muscles and things like that. There was an indication that it might work in neuromuscular disease, but there's also a significant lack of evidence to demonstrate that it works in general neuromuscular disease. So we're still prohibited because the studies can't take a population, even a population, for example, of migraine, and say, what's the severity, what's the level, have they been tried on other medications, have they been tried on standard medications, has there been a dosing interval where they were titrated up to a maximum dose and did it not work, and then use a medical marijuana. Those kind of studies have not been done to any great degree. So as a result of that, there's a lot of anecdotes, there's a lot of information, there's people who have talked about it, there's a limit in the amount of study, but there's this lack of defense. And so a medical professional is caught in two things. One is law. How far can they go with a Title I drug federally? And how far can they go within their own state? And then also, how much evidence do they have to try this out? Because at current, this is a drug, medical marijuana is a drug that's used when everything else has failed. In California and in other states, they don't have to prove that everything else has failed. But because of the lack of evidence, because of the lack of safety, there's a significant amount of concern about that, because these drugs are not without side effects, and they're not without problems. So in that regard, a physician doesn't want to do harm by doing it. So they're really holding it frequently to the fact that the patient has tried everything else and nothing else has worked. And the condition has been, in general, intractable.
So there's no defense for it at all, as far as medically. And then you say that there's no evidence. There's doctors that are stuck between federal law, state law, but they're also stuck with the patients that might have a high demand for it, just judging from the popularity it's gained.
Yes.
And but as a clinician, when a patient is demanding it and they demand that they use this because they don't like the side effects of this drug, should it then be at least prescribable, even though there's very little evidence to support it?
I think everybody is tentative in that regard. There's clearly strong evidence that when other medications have failed in nausea and vomiting from cancer chemotherapy, that you have a reasonable chance of treating with medical marijuana. There's also evidence, not overtly strong, but there's still evidence for using it in migraine headaches, using it to a degree in people with MS, multiple sclerosis, who've also tried other medicines and are having trouble with the spasticity, and perhaps there's some benefit from the spasticity. These are not a cure. So we're not curing anything. All we're doing is trying to deal with something where the patient has already tried prescription medications and the others in general have failed, or they've done it. Now the real problem that you brought up is this, and that is the patient's demanding the care. In the and there is a legal documentation about this and precedence, and that is the doctor can only go so far in helping a patient who's demanding the care. If there's a diagnosis, if it's well established because they have gone through a physical and they have documented everything, then there may be a need for it. But if there isn't a very clear need for it, then the doctor is potentially moving out of scope. And if they do so, then they're out of scope of the state laws for covering it for medical uses.
Right.
And as a result of that, then they can get into trouble over what happens as a federal Title I drug. So it's it's a slippery slope here, and the
Right.
doctor has to be very careful because they are potentially sacrificing their license if they go with a demand, which may be well documented. We're not talking about people who are doing it just because they want it for recreational use.
Right, of course.
We're talking about it because the patient wants it, but they haven't tried everything else. Or maybe they think it is appropriate and they can give it under certain limitations in order to do that. But they have to be very careful how much leeway they give in that regard, because then there is this conflict between federal and state law, and if they cross the scope of the state law, then they themselves could be in trouble with their license.
Right. And is this more than just the state paying for it? Because I don't think the state will cover it, right?
This has nothing whatsoever to
Right.
do with how it's being paid.
Right.
It has everything to do with whether the drug is effective, whether it's safe, and whether there is a rationale for its use when there are other things that could be used to treat it.
Right.
So in that regard, it has nothing to do with how it's paid. It has to deal very much with what they're doing. And it's important because, as I said, medical marijuana is not without risk. There is certainly, in chronic use, there are respiratory problems. There are problems with chronic bronchitis. There are problems that has been well established in motor vehicle accidents when its use can cause motor vehicle accidents because the patient's sensorium is not clear.
Right.
So there are indications here, but there are not even long-term studies to identify chronic use that there are effects in other conditions. There's even some evidence, for example, that people who are on long-term use develop schizophrenia, but it's not quite clear. Because it's not quite clear if the patient was already schizophrenic or had indications that they would become schizophrenic and be using marijuana. So as I've talked about, others have talked about, it's a chicken and egg thing.
Right.
Was it the marijuana or was it schizophrenia? What is it? Bottom line is they're not without risk. But all prescription medicines have a risk.
Right.
In prescription medicine world, you have studies that demonstrate what the actual risk is. You have studies that demonstrate what the effectiveness is. In the case of marijuana, we're running a line where we don't really know what the effectiveness is or the risk is. That's the problem.
Right. Well, moving on, there has been talk of marijuana being used to move people off of opiates, and it's been well established that socially that there is an opiate epidemic where there's a lot of people dying from opiate abuse or just opiate use in general for a long term. And based on the available evidence that we do have of marijuana so far, can this be used as an alternative to the opiates to maybe quell this opiate epidemic?
Possibly. It certainly has been used, and there are anecdotal information that identifies that it can be used in chronic pain, not acute pain, but in chronic pain. And clearly chronic pain that has to deal with some chronic conditions like arthritis or maybe some cancer pain issues, bone pain and things like that. So potentially there is.
Right.
What is very important in the opiate issue is that we created the problem.
Right.
The opiate epidemic is here because we prescribed and allowed this to occur. Now we have to deal with it. We have to fix it. And yes, the medical uses of marijuana may very well turn out to be an appropriate avenue. So may be physical therapy, so may be all kinds of other alternative medicine approaches, etc., to try other things other than drugs to deal with it.
Right.
But at the end of the day, a good deal of this started out in opiates, started out as acute care therapy, and then was continued as acute care therapy in a standard way, but it wasn't stopped. And as a result of it, it turned into chronic therapy. So we need to address the problem, and we as medical professionals need to address the problem because we created it.
Right.
Now we've got to stop it.
Right.
And everything that's been done has to address that.
Right. Well, the opiate issue seems like a very interesting topic, and we'll probably broach that topic next week. But just to wrap things up, it looks like marijuana. There's very little evidence to support it, but we're looking to the future. Maybe we can get more studies, understand more about its side effects, and hopefully some potential uses. Anyways, you can visit our RX Info X page. It's a page that we exchange information for free. It's on propharmaconsultants.com/RxInfoX. We'll have new videos for you next Wednesday at noon. Please like, share, and subscribe. And any comments you may have, please put them below. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.